Hello, this is Tony Blazer back on a video here for the Motocross Vault, and for this one what we're going to do is we're going to cover the second issue of Inside Motocross. As I covered in the first one, Inside Motocross was a very important, iconic magazine that was produced in the early 90s, 93 and 94, or actually maybe, 93, maybe the very beginning of 94 is when they finally shut it down. Only ran 4 issues. It was produced by Jim Hale, who was the gentleman behind Axo Sport America, and the editor was Fran Kuhn. Was known for its beautiful photography, just a gorgeous, gorgeous, glossy, kind of a coffee table book almost, more than a magazine. This issue here is number 2. It's probably one of my favorites, actually. This has some great shots in it from all the works bikes of the time, some great articles. For what I've done in these is I'm actually scanning the entire magazine. I've taken my original copies and I've scanned them, and I've uploaded them in like a PDF form, and we're going to go through page by page and add my thoughts and my recollections about the magazine at the time. I love all these. They're great. This one, like I said, is probably my favorite, but all of them are good for their own reasons. The photography is phenomenal. It's much more of a lifestyle magazine, though. It's not really covering the races in the way a modern Cycle News would be doing. Actually, not modern. The way Cycle News or Motocross Action was doing back at the time. It was more like covering the people behind the sport, kind of like Racer X does now. Very, very important magazine, and certainly influential, and all the more important and interesting for the fact that it only lasted those 4 issues. It kind of was like blazed really bright for a little bit and then flamed out. Unfortunately, was shut down. A lot of that probably due to pressure from inside the industry, but that's a story for another time. If you like this one, check out the others. I've done issue 1, and I'll do issue 2. I'm sorry, this is issue 2. I'll be doing issue 3 and 4 as well, so check them out on the channel. And if you like this sort of thing, make sure you give it a like and share it on social media. I appreciate it. So this is issue 2 of Inside Motocross. Alright, so here we have issue 2 of Inside Motocross. This was the brainchild of Axo Sports' Jim Hale. He partnered with Fran Kuhn, and they produced one of the most iconic magazines of the motocross industry. It was produced in 1993, only made 4 issues. The magazine, I guess, ended in 94, 93, 94. The magazine, like I said, was really groundbreaking at the time. The design of it, the art design, the photography, the ads, everything was just very different than what you would see in a typical motocross action or dirt bike at the time. The magazine was beautiful. It was oversized, like a coffee table book almost. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous piece of literature. The magazine ended largely because of pressure from inside the industry. I know Jody Weissel at MXA felt like the magazine was kind of encroaching on their territory. Axo was one of the largest advertisers at Motocross Action and had been a partner with Jim from the beginning of his starting Axo Sport America in the mid 80s. And I think Jody kind of felt that Jim was betraying that by kind of moving in on his territory, so put some pressure on Axo and its other advertisers that were in the magazine to not support it. So in the end, Jim decided it was smarter to stop doing the magazine than endanger his core business, which was selling gear, not selling motocross magazines. So the fact that it only made 4 issues probably has something to do with the fact that it's so well regarded and beloved in the industry. But like I said, it only made 4 issues. This is the second one, and we're going to go through it page by page, and I'll add a little bit of insight and thought, hopefully, as we go. This first ad in the magazine on page 2-3 is one for the 93 Honda CR250. At the time, Jeff Stanton was coming off his 3rd AMA Supercross title, which unfortunately be his last. With the coming of Jeremy McGrath to the 250 class in 1993, Jeff's reign at the top was over, but for this last one, it is an awesome ad. Shows him kind of flying through the air. Definitely an iconic shot of one of the coolest champions of the 90s for sure. Here we have the table of contents photo. It is by one of the definitely the most prolific early 90s photographers in the moto industry, Naoki Shibata. I'm probably butchering that name, sorry. Most people know him as Shiba. He was responsible for some really great shots in the early 90s, Japanese photographer. This one is from the floor of the Anaheim Stadium in 1993, the scene of Jeremy McGrath's first Supercross win. And it kind of outlines some of the cool stuff you're going to see in the magazine, and also gives you a feel for how different it was going to be as far as the visual style with its large format and stuff. You really get a large palette to show these cool photographs like this. This next page is a good example of the different look of the magazine. It has a very obviously artistic style, some great photography, in this case by Fran Kuhn of Damon Bradshaw, kind of warming up before the race. If you look at some of the contributors too, you can see there's really a who's who of early 90s motocross. You have guys like Davey Coombs, the current guy behind Racer X, and also the motocross series. Luke Verbeek, a very famous European motocross photographer. Kenny Jones, another guy, early 90s icon. Basically a who's who. This magazine, it's easy to see why it was so beautiful when you see all the people that kind of put time into it, which makes it all the more sad that it only lasts 4 issues. But like I said, it was really groundbreaking for its time. The magazine itself is just beautiful, and today it doesn't look dated at all. If anything, it's more more impressive for the fact that so many magazines now are dying. So it's almost like a lost art. But I definitely treasure every one of these. It's just a beautiful magazine. Page 8 and 9 here have some interesting tidbits of information on it. The upper left, there's a little piece on showing Mike Kudrowski's factory Kawasaki being shipped from Japan. I'm not sure if they still do this, but certainly back in the early 90s, the factory Kawasaki's were actually built in Japan. They weren't built here. They came shipped in a crate, just like a regular production bike, to America with the works parts already installed. They were basically pulled off the production line, and they just looked them over really carefully, picked the ones that were the closest to being perfect without any imperfections, and shipped them over that way. Below that, there's also a interesting little tidbit on the difference in the people's haulers at the time at the track. At this time, the semis were still quite a novelty. Most guys were still in box vans. You can see like the DGY ones are shown here. You had Pro Circuit with like a hauler, and then Kawasaki was the first one to do it. I think in '92, '93 Yamaha had a full-size semi, but people like Honda, I think, if I remember right, were still in box vans in '93. So this is kind of a transition period where they're kind of highlighting the difference in the shift towards that. In the upper right, you have a cool little bit on Hot Wheels, and Pro Circuit switched to Kawasaki for '93. Pretty amazing how Honda had a lot of success with Mitch in '92 and '91, and then they decided to take the 125 effort in house in '93, which obviously caused a lot of friction with Mitch and Pro Circuit. So they switched to Kawasaki for '93, and the gentleman who's behind getting the bikes right here, Mike Hooker, is talking about the differences in the bikes, how the Kawasaki's did not have the power the Hondas at the time, but the suspension was better, the bike handled better. So it was a give and take there, and I know from interviews with Mitch at the time and later that the Kawasaki's definitely need a little work at this time. They were a pretty good bike. The production bike, I remember, was a pretty good bike. It had an issue with blowing up that year, so I'm sure that was something they had to work through too, to try to squeeze a little more power out of it. But you can see this is Jamie Dobbs' Kawasaki. I hated this looks of this bike at the time in '93. I thought it looked ridiculous, but of course now I think it looks awesome. Definitely the '90s were such an amazing time for color, and again at the time, coming from the '80s, it seemed like holy crap, this was such a radical departure in terms of the looks of some of the bikes in the early '90s. But in hindsight, I love it now. So I guess as you get older, you look back and think things are cooler than they were. On our next page, we have a couple interesting articles. You have at the top left, apparently there was a thing where somebody decided it was a cool idea to paint their toolbox to match their helmet. They, in fact, talked to Jeremy McGrath, and he says he's not quite sure if that's going to catch on, and it's my recollection that it did not. I don't remember ever seeing anybody with a toolbox painted like their helmet, but Maybe somebody somewhere did. Below that is a article on the kind of the craze towards turning your mild mannered XRs into fire-breathing race bikes. Over the years, this kind of fad has come and gone. In the late 70s, there was a definitely a craze for pit bike racing, where guys were turning these little pit bikes into fire-breathing racers. In the late 80s, early 90s, you had the same kind of thing with the rise of like the Langtown race, where guys would take these breathed-on little XRs and stick them in motocross chassis and race them in a backyard Supercross. In the early 2000s, you had the same thing with the 50s, but I think this stuff ebbs and flows. People will get crazy about it, spend $10,000 on some crazy little mini bike, and then it kind of wanes. At the bottom there, you have Damon Bradshaw. He's actually putting an autograph on Keith McCarty's son's face with a Sharpie on his forehead, which is pretty funny. Lord knows how long that stayed on his head. On the right here, you have a pretty cool ad for Scott. This is obviously one of the iconic brands in the sport, and Scott was one of the people that went along with Inside Motocross here and helped support the magazine. This one's got Jeff Stanton on there and their new Super V technology, which I got to be honest, I don't remember what was so great about Super V, but in any case, it's a pretty sweet looking ad. Page 12 has some pretty good stuff on it. First and foremost is obviously the picture of Dan Cortese and I think Brian Austin Green, if I remember his name correctly, who was from 90210, which is a very popular soap opera on Fox at the time. This is a pretty funny picture, but it doesn't obviously show the best part, which was a video of Cortese getting on, I think, an RM125, if I remember right, and then he immediately whiskey throttles it over a berm and knocks the living crap out of himself. Pretty iconic bit of moto history there. Everybody got a pretty good laugh out of it, except Cortese, who, as I said, knocked the crap out of himself. You got a picture below that of Roy Jansen, who's obviously a guy who's been around the races for years and years with the AMA, and then later with Feld. He's taking some pictures here of Jeff Emig at the 93 Gainesville opener. At the bottom is Denny Stevenson getting pounded in the head by Phil Lawrence, I think, and probably Buddy Antunez. Actually looks like Jeff Matasevich, actually. Obviously, those guys were enjoying themselves in the early 90s, having a good time. And then over the left, you have a little bit of a French invasion where Mikel Pichon and then a couple other guys, Cyril Porte, Frederic Vallet, and Jan Golidard, which I don't remember ever hearing about him. A couple of those guys came to the U.S. to race some of the early rounds in '93. Obviously, Mikel Pichon made quite a name for himself here and had a good deal of success in the U.S. Before finally going back to France and winning a few world titles back there as well. On the right, you have a cool ad for No Fear. This is before No Fear was doing motocross gear. They were more of a lifestyle brand at that time, doing like casual wear, and you saw those No Fear stickers everywhere on trucks and cars and bikes and helmets, and it was a pretty popular brand in the early 90s here. And you have Mike Kodrowski running one of the 93 Answer Racing gel prints, probably sweating to death as we speak in this ad. This next section of the magazine is one of my favorites of any of these Inside Motocrosses. It has some coverage of the factory bikes of the time in '93. It goes behind the scenes to the race shops. This one is actually going to Honda and talks to the guy, J.C. Waterhouse, who was running things over there at the time. Talks a little bit about the expense of turning these bikes from production machines into works racers. Has some really cool photography in it. By far my favorite part though is the cool photos of the bikes in the pages after that. This next ad is for Boyson Racing's Rad Valve, which was a big deal in the early 90s. Boyson is one of the iconic brands in motocross. They were the guys that came up with dual stage reeds at a time when all the reeds were metal. They had some really lightweight fiber reeds that would give the bike a great deal more response. And the Rad Valve basically replaced the whole intake on your bike. I don't even know if they still make them, but probably do for two strokes. I know that like the V4, so there's a lot of different ones you can get now, but this is one of the first ones there that really came up with the idea to just replace the whole reed block and assembly and everything with a different intake to improve the power on your two-stroke. All right, this next section is by far my favorite of probably any of the four issues of Inside Motocross. This one is the one that covers the factory bikes of '93. Like I said, there's some amazing photography in here from Fran Kuhn. The bikes are colorful, they're beautiful, they're iconic. It's a really, really awesome section of the magazine. First up is Dan Bentley and Jeff Stanton's #1 Honda CR250R. Dan obviously was Jeff's mechanic during his run at Honda and is currently the team manager over at I think it's Geico Honda right now. On the second page here, he has a couple of works parts they highlight, showing the badass pipe that's got some custom welds in it, factory clamps, factory shock, which has a different body to accommodate the works valving inside. The cylinder is a production unit that's modified in Japan by HRC, or Honda R&D at the time. I guess HRC was technically no longer in use in '93. I'm not sure what went down with that, but they decided to phase out HRC for a few years there. Those frame guards you see at the upper right, obviously, once Honda started putting them on there, you had guys like Works Connection and some other companies making kind of replica guards of that. It became quite a fad when everybody still had steel frames. On the next page, you get to see the actual bike itself in all its glory. All right, here we have Jeff Stanton's '93 Honda CR250R. It's funny, when this thing first came out in '92, I hated the looks of these things. After '91 with the tiger stripe seat, I thought that was a little ridiculous. I love my '90. I love the orange. When they went to the nuclear red, which really was a pink in '92, I was not on board. I hated the white tank. I just hated all of this stuff. But it's funny, like so much of this, it's really grown on me now. I love the look of it, especially in '93. They changed the picture. I'm sorry, not the picture. The hue of the plastic in '93 to a more deep red. There's issues in '92 where the plastic didn't hold up well. It started out like a flow pink and quickly turned like a salmon color as soon as the sun hit it. It was kind of a weird color. It was, you could actually kind of see through the plastic. It was almost translucent. So it didn't hold up very well. And in '93 and then again in '94, they started dialing back the pink and adding a little more deep red into it. So the '93 in particular is a really great looking bike. And unfortunately, Jeff Stanton was only able to get one win that year. I think if I remember right, he won Vegas, and Jeremy McGrath stomped everybody. So Jeff did at least put it up on the podium top step one time, but no matter what, he looked great doing it. On page 28, we have Shane Nally, and he was Mike Godrowski's mechanic in '93. There's some really cool works parts on page 29 here. Really, really badass looking linkage. The pipe, the works pipe they had was pretty cool. Although I know Kawasaki, they actually used to run a stock pipe sometimes. They just take the paint off and stuff. So that pipe may just be a lightly modified one. I'm not sure. The shock body you can see is has that beautiful hue to it. They used to put on a lot of the work stuff, that kind of coppery gold. I love that color. That works. Clutch covers really cool too. Just the little things like that set a factory bike apart from your average run-of-the-mill production machine. On page 30 and 31, we have Mike's factory racer that year. This '93 Kawasaki, I think it looks pretty badass now. I liked it even then, although some people weren't really a fan of the really cartoony graphics. But I remember that year I thought it was a really cool looking bike. It was a little more colorful than the '92, which I didn't, same basic bodywork, but I didn't care for the graphics and stuff as much. What's interesting about this bike is you're going to see that at this point in Supercross, the side panels normal shape and stuff, but as the year went on, Shane started cutting the number plates back in a strange way, which by the end of the Nationals, they basically started at the end style #3 there. It was a strange look I didn't really care for. I mean, I guess it made his life easier and it wasn't peeling back the decals, but I hated that look. I didn't really like it. A couple of interesting things you can see on the his factory bike here. You can see there's a high and low speed adjuster on the shock, which obviously wasn't stock at that time. You couldn't get that. Little things like the sight hole is been on the side cases have been covered up with a metal plate so it doesn't get knocked out. That little glass piece could come out if you weren't careful. This is obviously a full works version of a Kawasaki at the time, but there was a production rule in effect in '93, so they could only modify certain things. It had to use a stock frame, more or less. I'm sure they probably still stretch the rules a little bit, as most of the teams do, but this basic bike wasn't that much different than a stock Kawasaki. Just had some really trick parts on it, and some cool looking graphics. To that end, actually, you can see the graphics really are more or less the same as a as a stock Kawasaki at the time. That MXA seat is pretty trick, but the graphics themselves don't really look any different than what came on your stock KX at the time. Next up on page 32 is Marshall Plum, and he was Brian Swink's mechanic in '93. If you look at some of the works parts on the right here, they're actually less exotic looking to me than the stuff on the Honda or the Kawasaki. The frame is basically a stock frame with some light gusseting. They used a stock bottom clamp. The pipe is a works part, but it's not a custom like cone pipe. It doesn't have nearly that trick look that like the one that the Honda had. The shock body, it doesn't have the cool anodizing. It is a stock outer body, obviously custom valving inside, but overall the bike is more production than the Kawasaki or the Honda, and it kind of shows in the trickness of the parts. The bikes still look good, but I think under the skin, the Suzuki wasn't working with near the budget of the others at the time, or now for that matter. All right, here we have Brian Swink's race bike for '93. As I said earlier, it probably was more production than the most of the other teams. But at the time, I thought it looked awesome. Basically, that's due mainly to the Technocell graphics. I really love this design in '93. I love that Cobra wavy seat. I had one on my CR. I just thought the thing looked cool. It was a radical departure from '92, where the bike was, had tiger stripes and splats on the seat, and maybe the fact that it was all yellow was what was attracting me, because in '92 and '91 I hated the looks of the factory bikes. I was like, I didn't know what was going on over in Japan. I thought somebody hit their head. So this switch back to a more traditional look, I just loved it. The big Suzuki S on the shroud. The stock bike this year, I wasn't too much of a fan of the looks of it, but this works version was really cool. That case reed motor never really worked very well. The motor was all mid-range. Power main was short. I'm sure this factory bike was probably a little bit better, but I think from talking to people, Brian Swink and Cooper and the people who actually rode him at the time, I don't think this bike was that great. It did look cool though, which again is half the battle. Last up on the tour of the factory racers is Damon Bradshaw's mechanic Brian Lunas, who was Rick Johnson and Bob Hanna's mechanic in the '80s. Went to Bradshaw after RJ was kind of at the twilight of his career. Brian was always kind of a mercurial guy. He works for Mechanics Wear now. Always struck me as a dude with a bad attitude, but I guess he had desire to win and didn't really take it very well when his guys didn't do as well as he thought they should. Some people even attribute to Mike Kudrowski's early retirement to Brian's influence, but who knows what the truth of that is. These works parts on the right are pretty cool. Like I said, they definitely have a cooler look to them than the Suzuki stuff, which was very production looking. That the brake carrier, the shock body, the clamps, all that stuff's obviously works and looks the part. Which the works bikes are about winning, but they're also about marketing and making your brand look cool. So adding that little bit of extra bling, I think, definitely helps the image of the brand overall. Here's Damon's '93 factory racer. I loved the '92 bike. My best friend had one. It was a great machine, although a little wide in the middle. But this '93, I didn't really care for the looks of it at the time. This works graphics were not really my cup of tea that year. At the time, I will say it's cool that they were a radical departure from the stock looking YZ. I do like this era that some of the bikes were different. You know, the purple seat and the crazy orange graphics are pretty cool. Now I like the looks of it. It's pretty cool, but it's definitely very 90s with the rainbow graphics and everything going on the bike. But again, in '93, I was kind of like, wow, this thing's a little out there for me. But I think history has shown that stuff is pretty popular now, so maybe I was on the wrong side of history on that one. On page 40 and 41, we have a nice little closeout to the factory bike section, showing the actual bikes in action with the riders on board and a quote by Teddy Roosevelt. On the next page is also a cool ad for Oakley's new Pro Frame, which has kind of a cool black, almost carbon fiber look to it. I know Oakley, I never could wear them. They don't. I wear glasses, so even the over glasses versions are always so tight. I never could get them to work over my glasses. Always ended up with Scott or Smith because they had a little larger frame. But I've always taken a lot of pride in the fact that Oakley has become such a big international brand and had its roots in motocross. So even though I have nothing to do with the company, I always smile when I see it go to the mall and I see that Oakley brand there. I take a little bit of pride in that its roots are in motocross. This next section is a series of interviews. First up is one with Jeremy McGrath by one Davey Coombs. This is done midway through the '93 season, so he's not the Supercross champ yet. Talks about his more modest roots racing BMX and how he's really into that. Doesn't have any fancy cars yet. Although he does say at the end of the interview he will get himself an Acura NSX if he wins the title. So I think the kid did pretty well. What do you think? The second interview we have is with a very young Robbie Raynard, who at the time of this interview is 15 years old. And this one's done by Davey Coombs as well. Talks about Robbie running tanks of gas through his KX125, getting ready for his pro debut later that year. Like I said, he was 15, so he's not old enough to drive and not old enough to race at the pro level yet. Obviously, the kid did pretty well. He won a 125 national. I think he's still the youngest guy ever to win one too that year. Won the last one at Steel City. So, unfortunately, Robbie's career didn't go exactly as planned. He, due to injuries, probably more than anything, he never was able to probably reach the levels that people thought at this point he would. But had a hell of a career either way, and it's kind of cool to see interviews like this one before he had even turned pro and know now how things went for him. Our third interview is by Fran Kuhn and is with suspension guru John Rosenstyle, probably more commonly known as John R., who at this point was working in Yamaha's race shop doing suspension work. John R. was a long-time mechanic on the national circuit, wrenching for Honda in the 70s, and then Yamaha took Brock Glover to the 500 national title. This interview kind of talks a little bit about his early career and what he's doing now. Definitely an interesting little piece of motor history here. Our fourth interview is with Belgian motocross hero Stefan Everts. This one's done by Davey Coombs, and at this point in his career, Stefan was just a single 125 world champ. He had won the '91 world title over Donnie Schmidt, but then in '92 and '93 he had lost out. Actually, this is mid '93, but he would lose out to Greg Albertine. Many people saw Stefan as like the savior of Belgian motocross. His dad, Harry, was a world titleist and obviously had quite a great pedigree. Stefan would go on, obviously, to be the greatest European motocrosser of all time. But at this point, '93, he talks a lot about the troubles he's had and the pressure he's under, but they hadn't really had the success that people would hope for yet. Those days will still be in the future at this point. Our next interview is with Team Green manager Mark Johnson, who was a racer himself in the '70s, a mechanic, and ran the early days of Kawasaki's Team Green amateur program. Mark would go on also to manage several teams. I think most recently he was actually with RCH Suzuki, so even today he's been involved with the sport. I think he had stints in road racing and some other stuff. He's definitely got quite a long and varied resume there. But at this point, he was still helming Team Green, which was Kawasaki's amateur program that really changed the sport. He was talking about in the interview all the riders that had gone through their program. It's basically a who's who that who was winning at that point. They had McGrath and Mike Craig, Brian Swink, Larry Ward, Larry Brooks, Jeff Emig, all those guys had gone through their program, and even at 18 Green's a powerful entity in the sport. So he was one of the guys that helped make it what it is. So it's definitely an interesting interview to go back and I definitely love the picture on the right there with the powerful mullet he's got going on. Very 90s there, Mark. I like that. Our sixth interview is with a very young Mikhail Pichon, who was 17 at the time of this interview by Fran Kuhn. Mikhail was coming to Anaheim to kind of get his feet wet in America. He would actually go on a couple years later to get a ride with Pro Circuit Kawasaki and bring home a couple of 125 titles for the brand. He never was as successful in the 250 class here in America. I think he won maybe a single moto. I think either Glenn Helen or Gatorback. I don't remember now, but never was quite as successful in the 250 class. He ended up going to Factory Honda and then having a blowout with some guys at High Point with his dad that ended up getting him fired from his Honda ride. And after that, he went back to Europe and had quite a successful run, winning several world titles. Mikhail's one of those guys you hear a lot of crazy stories about. Moto was very crazy in the 90s, and Mikhail was definitely one of the guys in the middle of all that, I think. The last interview in this issue is with Larry Ward, and it's done by Davey Coombs. It's a pretty interesting interview where Larry talks about how lucrative it is to race in Europe in the off-season and how he can make double what he makes in America in a couple of months racing overseas. You see less and less of guys doing that these days, but in the 80s and early 90s, racing in Europe at races like Bercy and Geneva and places was big money. And you saw everybody doing it. They'd race all year here in the AMA circuit, and then they'd go overseas in the fall and make a lot of money over there. At this point, Larry had lost his factory ride with Suzuki, which amazingly he'd finished fifth in the 125 Nationals the year before, but they fired him. Larry's an interesting story because he's one of the guys that kind of broke that stigma where you could lose your factory ride and actually come back and get it. He would go to, after spending a little time on a privateer Suzuki here in 93, he would go to the No Lean Sizzler team in 94 and in 95 and have a really good run there, finishing second in the title. I think probably still the highest finishing privateer in the Supercross series. After that, he went to Honda Troy and back to factory Suzuki in the late 90s and ended up winning a race like I think 8 years between his wins, which again may be a record. I don't remember if anybody's ever beaten that one. It'd be a hard one to beat, but Larry had a hell of a career, long career. A lot of people were already writing him off here at age 22 in the early 90s, so it's pretty impressive he was able to bounce back like he did and prove everybody wrong. On page 56 and 57 we have a little section they call Design, and this one covers the Penske shock, which was a development in the early 90s from Roger Penske's company, who has car dealerships today and was big into car racing at the time. It talks about the correlation between motocross shocks and high-end automotive shocks. One of the guys from Fox Shocks actually was working with Penske, and there was some cross-pollination between the two designs. I never was able to actually buy one of these shocks. I was racing on a very limited budget, so I don't know how successful these things were. I don't even know how much they cost back then. It was pretty trick for its time, though. It had high and low speed compression adjustability, which again in 93 wasn't something you'd see on a production shock. I'm sure this thing was pretty trick, but I don't know how successful they were. Like I said, it's one of these things that I remember reading about but had no personal experience with. Pretty trick looking though. On page 58 we have another design. This one is on Boyson's new float bowl, which was an oversized float bowl that would just bolt onto your stock carburetor to give it a little more fuel volume that would help prevent it from starving for fuel under heavy loads when there might be some sloshing in the carburetor or frothing. This, along with the addition of vents to the overflow tubes, really helped carburation and preventing the bike from bogging when you're in the whoops or under heavy G loads. Prior to this, the bike would bog when you'd kind of unload and then wrap the throttle real hard. It might starve for a second or even vacuum lock. But when you added the vent tubes to the carburetor and also this larger float bowl, it really helped with that.
That race case in the bottom, I never had that particular one, but I do still have an AXO one from '93. I still use to this day, still holds up, so that definitely lasted a while. On the right, you have Eric Kehoe, who was a Honda privateer in '93. He had spent some time, obviously, with factory Suzuki in the late '80s, and then become a privateer after that. Uh, in '93, he was a member of the new Honda Troy team. Really, there wasn't much of a team. I think him and maybe Todd DeHoop were on this team. That would become a pretty powerful race team, though, later. Kehoe would go on to be the race team manager for Honda of Troy and then later Yamaha of Troy. And they would win several Supercross titles. They were really right up there with Pro Circuit for a while. Unfortunately, the guy behind it, Phil Alderton, he had some substance abuse issues, and they would end up claiming his life later, which was a really sad end to a great story. But from the early '90s until the mid 2000s, Honda slash Yamaha Troy was really a power in the sport, and this is definitely something from the early days of that. On page 60, we have another design installment. This one's on mountain bike technology at the time. And I got to be honest, for '93, these are some pretty trick bikes. They have full suspension, front and rear. The one on the bottom actually has a disc in the back, which I can tell you, man, my mountain bike in '93 didn't have any of this stuff. Of course, it cost $4,000, which was a lot of money. The same basic money it would have cost you to buy a CR500 or something at the time. So this would have been pretty expensive stuff. I imagine a bike like this is, I don't know, $10,000, $12,000 now. So in '93, though, this was super trick. On the right, you got a FMF ad. The Flying Machine Factory goes back to the early days of the sport. And at this point, they were pretty heavily involved as well with supporting some teams. They didn't have their own team yet, though. It would be a couple of years later. I think maybe '98 was the first year when they actually had their own team there for a couple of years. But that didn't, unfortunately, didn't last long either. But FMF's still around and they're still supporting two strokes, so they got my vote. On page 62 and 63, this is the start of the gallery section where they highlight some really great photography by some of the best photo hounds at the time. This one of Jeff Stanton is really cool. It's he's kind of silhouetted there in front of the roof of the Houston Astrodome, which at one point was one of the wonders of the world. This one's shot by Sheba. Definitely a cool photo and something different than what you would see in like a motocross action or something at the time, which is a lot of what would really set this magazine apart at the time. On page 64 and 65, we have some photos of Damon Bradshaw shot by Fran Kuhn. These are from Houston, which was round 2 in 1993. At the time, Damon Bradshaw was coming off major knee surgery from an injury he had suffered at Redbud the year before, and in my opinion, probably cost him the '92 Supercross title because he ended up having to ride the Coliseum with a blown ACL fresh off that injury. Damon, starting the '93 season, he had got a third at round 1 and actually came out and won round 2. So a lot of people thought, okay, yeah, well, he's back. I will say that even when you watch him in interviews, he didn't seem like the same guy. He just had like a bad attitude that only seemed to get worse as the year went on. He was definitely happy at this win, but like I said, his attitude just didn't seem to be quite the same. Obviously, at the end of the year, he would retire prematurely. It's pretty clear he wasn't happy at this point. Whether or not that would have happened if he had won the title and there had been no Jeremy McGrath, it's probably hard to say. I would bet probably not, but who knows? History can't be rewritten at this point. So, as it was, Damon won this, and I think Atlanta, if I remember right. So he did get those 2 wins that year, but he really was no challenge to McGrath all season. Our next shot is by Joe Bonello, and it's from the starting line at Anaheim 1, which actually there probably was only one Anaheim in '93, but be that as it may, this is from Anaheim Supercross, right behind Mike LaRocco, Kodrowski, you can see Emig and McGrath. This would actually end up being McGrath's first Supercross win in the 250 class, and really this floodgates would open after this, and he never would really be challenged seriously for this title. Pretty amazing considering he was a rookie. Although he was older at this point, he's actually older than McGrath. I'm sorry, older than Damon Bradshaw. He just got a little later start. Bradshaw kind of burst out so early, but Jeremy was amazing this year, and this was kind of the start of what would be an amazing run for the champ. Page 68 and 69 has some cool photos of Yamaha's new big rig. Like I said, this is a pretty big deal at the time. The switch from the box fans to the rigs was a major shift in the sport. I don't know whether it actually made it cheaper or more expensive as far as the teams go. It definitely gave them more workspace, and the mechanics got to get off the road and got to fly. So definitely a net gain there. I imagine it's probably better. I mean, at the time it was thought it would just make the sport look more professional, like more like NASCAR or IndyCar racing or something. But I'm not sure how that all panned out. Like everything, we always think it's going to make some big change, but it doesn't really seem to bring the popularity up that much more. But it definitely has a cool look. I did like the box fan days. I loved being able to go and into the pits and actually talk to the riders and the mechanics and see what they were doing. There's a disconnect that kind of comes from the semis. You know, they go hide inside, so you don't, not quite as intimate as it was in the 80s and 90s, but definitely the way things are going. You can't turn back the clock, like I said earlier, so it was a cool innovation at the time. On page 71 and 70, we have a couple of cool photographs. The one on the upper left is one shot by Fran Kuhn, and it's actually a picture of Dirt Rider doing their photo shoot of the factory bikes. I used to love these layouts. Actually, I still do. I would pull them out and plaster my wall. My whole wall in my bedroom was covered in cool photos like these ones of Damon Bradshaw's works bike and all the action shots. I kind of lament it now because I cut them all out and I don't have them anymore, so I've had to rebuy a lot of these classic magazines to scan the photos, but at the time it made for cool wallpaper. The main photo is of the San Diego Supercross track in '93. It's kind of interesting to look at it and see how different the layout is compared to a modern track. Obviously, if you put four strokes on this thing, it would flow a lot differently, but it's interesting to look how much track design has changed. If you look at from them to now, it has changed. It's not as much as it was, 10 years before this. And in '83 versus this track, it was a quantum shift in terms of design. But really, it's been a slow evolution now. Hasn't changed a whole lot since '93, really. On page 72 and 73, we have a couple of cool photos. One on the left is of Jeff DeMint on his DGY Yamaha by Carl Ockert. The one on the right is of Jimmy Gaddis on his Splitfire Pro Circuit Kawasaki KX125 by Fran Kuhn. I really love this whole outfit this year. The Splitfire, the helmet, the custom helmet, the gear, the exo gear, all that stuff looks awesome. It looks cool with this bike too. I miss the days when Pro Circuit had more than just a green monster claw and a little more variety to them. The main photo is by Fran Kuhn, and it's of Damon Huffman. This is from Anaheim, and this is Damon's first 125 Supercross win. He would go on to finish third in this series overall. I believe it was won by Jimmy Gaddis, in spite of winning only one round. Damon would win the title the next year in '94, and then back it up again in '95. On page 74 and 75, we have a couple of shots of Mikel Pichon. This one, again, by Fran Kuhn. Mikel rode 3 rounds in '93. He rode Anaheim, Seattle, and San Diego, and ended up winning the last round at San Diego in what would turn out to be his first of many U.S. victories. He went back to France after that, but then would be back, I think, in '95, and he would win the Supercross title for Mitch's team a couple of times on the Pro Circuit Kawasaki's. On page 76 and 77, we have a couple of really cool shots by Paul Buckley from the '93 Daytona Supercross. On the left, you got Jeremy McGrath leading Mike Kudrowski. Daytona was considered to be like the make-or-break race for McGrath in '93. A lot of people thought he was going to wilt. Prior to this, he had really been pretty unimpressive outdoors, and at the time, Daytona was much more of like an outdoor national. It was during the day in the heat. Rough as hell. The track wasn't very supercrossy. It was like a national with big jumps. And a lot of people thought McGrath was going to just really get waxed there. He ended up leading a lot of the race and finishing second to Kudrowski, who was a national guy really at the top of his game in '93. So it was a very impressive outing for McGrath, and I think only further dashed the hopes of many people who thought the kid wasn't for real. On the next page, you got Stanton, who was coming off, I think, 3 in a row at this point at Daytona. But on the start line before the main event, he had a shock bolt come out on his factory Honda. And there was a big mad scramble at the start of the race to try and get the shock bolt out and then put back in, a new one put in. And for the first couple of laps, Stanton was super tentative, for good reason, obviously. He was concerned that the bike wasn't right, because literally they were doing this on the line as the race is getting ready to go. By the time he got going, it was too late for him to challenge the front runner, so that ended the streak there. But it was still a good race for Stanton, considering the rest of the year was pretty mediocre. His finish there wasn't too bad. On page 78 and 79, we have a couple of more photos by Paul Buckley. The one on the upper left is of Mike Craig, who is the father of current star Christian Craig. Mike was on a Kawasaki this year, and actually was pretty impressive. It would end up actually earning him a factory ride the next year with Yamaha when Damon Bradshaw kind of surprisingly abruptly quit the sport at the end of the year. The main photo is of Damon Bradshaw from the one of the heat races. Damon, like I said, had an up and down year this year. I don't think he was very happy. He did end up finishing third, which for most people would be pretty good, but considering Damon won like 9 main events the year before, getting thirds and fourths and seconds and things just were not sitting well with him. I don't think he was happy at all this year. So you could see it even when he get a third, he seemed pissed off at the world. So unfortunately, this is probably a season Damon would like to forget. On page 80 and 81, we have some more Paul Buckley shots. This time it's of Factory Honda's Doug Henry and Factory Kawasaki's Mike Kudrowski. On the left, you have Doug taking the main event win in the 125 class. This was definitely the breakout year for Doug. He moved to the Factory Honda team from the DGY Yamaha team and took the title in the 125 East Coast Supercross class, as well as the outdoor as well. The Hondas in 93 were pretty acknowledged to be the best bikes out there, and certainly superior to the 92 Yamahas, which were not great bikes. On the 81, you have Kudrowski taking what would be his first Supercross win. He would go on to win 2 more Daytonas. He won 3 in a row, and one in 94 and 95. At the time in 93 here, Mike was probably the best outdoor guy by far. He absolutely killed everybody in the Nationals that year, and Daytona was really more of a national track almost than a Supercross event, like I said, being held during the day and such. And guys like Kudrowski and Stanton, Carmichael, when it was a day race, a lot of them really dominated at this race, and not really like it is today. But like I said, back in the 90s, this was a grueling race and definitely a man's track. Here we have a really awesome Factory Honda Renthal ad. Renthal was really killing it in the early 90s as well. Jim Hale was a distributor for Renthal, and they had taken them from kind of an obscure European brand to probably the dominant sprocket in the sport at the time. Their handlebars and sprockets were awesome. They looked great, and they were marketed very well by Hale. This ad really has a lot of a cool look to it with all the Factory Hondas lined up together. And this is when Factory Honda really meant something too. And back then they were just winning Supercross title after Supercross title, and the tie-in with Honda definitely helped take Renthal to the top of the sport for sure. On page 84 and 85, we have maybe the most iconic shot in motocross history. It's shot by Paul Buckley, and it's from the second moto at Gainesville in 1993. This shot is of Eric Kehoe absolutely launching the jump at the finish line to win the second moto. He was leading with Jeremy McGrath close behind, and Eric was concerned that Jeremy was going to clip him at the very end, so he just left his his Honda of Troy CR125 pinned over the finish line, and Buckley caught this moment perfectly. My buddy Brett Smith just did a great article on his website, We Went Fast, detailing how this shot was made. It was actually shot from, I think, several hundred yards away, amazingly, with a giant telephoto lens. He's actually on the other side of the track and just caught this moment. It's a really amazing shot. I wish we had more pictures from the actual side of it. Motor World had some video clip of it at the time, and you can see Kehoe just kind of looking side to side, turning the handlebars in the air, trying to figure out where to land, hoping he catches the backside of a whoop, which he luckily did. If he had hit the face of one, it probably would have broke his bike in half, but thankfully he landed just right and ended up no worse for the wear. and Buckley ended up with one of the coolest shots in motocross history. On page 86, we have another shot of Mike Kudrowski, this time by Jim Talkington. This is from Gatorback as well. Kudrowski smoked everybody this day, and like I said, he was really on fire in the Nationals that year. I think he won every moto except one. They had Glen Helen, which was the last round. They tried this one moto Supercross style format, and Kudrowski crashed really badly actually in practice. Went over the bars and the bike just tattooed him right in the back. He's like he didn't break anything serious, and he missed that race and LaRocco won it. But other than that, he had everybody covered that year. Just killed it. On the right, we have a mountain bike ad for a kind of mountain bike I actually don't remember, but I know mountain biking was getting really big in the early 90s. Guys realized that it made a nice cross training as opposed to just road biking because it could incorporate some off-road skills. Now I guess guys are mostly back on road biking, but mountain biking is nice if you can't. If you're somewhere where you can't get out and ride your motorcycle for environmental reasons, or you just don't want to, tear up the yard, you can get out and ride your mountain bike around. So some of these mountain bikes, even then, were pretty trick, and I'm sure pretty expensive, like we saw earlier. On page 88, we have a couple of cool shots here from Gatorback as well. On the top, we have Jeff Stanton airing out his factory Honda, and then below that we have John Dowd, who was on a Tough Racing Kawasaki, which I absolutely hated the looks of. Those graphics are hideous, but his gear's pretty ugly too. That MSR gear wasn't my favorite that year. It looked like it has like colored rice on his rear, which is just weird. At this time, John Dowd was known mainly as the guy who won the muddy Sacramento race in '91. He was like a privateer. Wasn't real well known. Also known for being really old at the time. I think he, maybe he's 26 or 27 at this point, but that was considered old. I mean, Stanton, I think he retired at 25. So John started much older. Definitely a late bloomer. This would end up, he'd go to No Lean. No, I'm sorry. He went to Boyson in '94. And then towards the end of the year, after Mike Craig imploded on the factory Yamaha, he would end up getting Craig's bike to ride towards the end of the Nationals. And that would lead to a full factory ride for John in '95, and he would stay with Yamaha for, I don't know, the next 4 or 5 years and end up giving them a 125 Supercross title. On the right here we have Axo's new RC2 boot with Kevlar in the instep. I have this boot. In fact, I still have it. It's in my garage. It was a great boot. I loved it. Loved the looks of it. It was a really, really comfortable boot for the time. Although I ended up switching to Alpine Stars a year or so after this, but I always loved this design. It looks great even today. On page 90, we have a couple more shots from Gatorback. This one is of Jeremy McGrath, and the one on the bottom is of Mike Craig and McGrath. Mike Craig actually was really surprised this year. He was running up front in a lot of the races in Supercross and outdoors. He ended up finishing third this day, third overall at Gatorback. And McGrath ended up getting the overall. I think this is his first overall in the outdoor nationals. Like I said previously, he had been really mediocre up to this point. I think he'd won maybe one moto at Southwick one year, but other than that, he had no overalls. And Jeremy, a lot of people thought he would just fade outdoors and wouldn't live up to what he was doing in Supercross, although he did, as it turns out. But at Gatorback here, he showed everybody by winning them overall in a great battle in the second moto with Kehoe. To show that he wasn't just going to be a Supercross only guy. Although it would take him another 2 years to finally get that title. He wouldn't get it until '95 in the 250 class. On the right we have an ad for AXO's new RX2 helmet, a Kevlar carbon fiber composite, which was pretty trick at the time. I actually never saw anybody wearing this helmet. Their helmets later became a little more popular towards the late '90s. There's a colorful design. I'm sure it looked great with their gear, but I was more interested in like a showy or something at the time. But it was cool. This was like AXO's first endeavor into getting into helmets, and I think it was pretty successful for him. Page 92 has some more cool photos from Gatorback. These are by Fran Kuhn. The one on the bottom is actually one of my favorite photos of Bradshaw ever. It's probably hard to see on here, but it's he is so over the front, leading with his head way over the bars. Just classic Bradshaw. His riding style was just so ahead of its time. I mean, a lot of guys probably poo-poo him today because he didn't win any titles, but he was a really a groundbreaking, trend-setting guy in the same kind of way that James Stewart was when he broke out. Bradshaw just had this raw aggression and over the front of the bike, always just charging style that I'd never seen before. And you just see it here. He's just so damn aggressive. He was just fun to watch. Definitely a game changer, even if he wasn't a guy who won a lot of titles. Above it, you have Jeff Emig, who was defending his 125 title. Unfortunately, he would suffer a couple of DNFs this year, bike problems. I think the ignition went out at Hangtown, if I remember right. But at least one round or two rounds, he had some problems, and that would end up costing him the title. He was right up there with Henry in terms of wins and speed that year, but bike problems cost him that title. On the right, we have Axo's new padlock glove, which had this weird rubbery material in the palm that was supposed to lock, in quotes, lock your hand to the grip. I never actually had one of these. I don't think that padlock stuff ever caught on to any great extent because in a year or two nobody's running it. They just had like the Clarion synthetic leather palms. Although I will say you do see some of the some synthetic like rubberized material even today on gloves on the fingertips and stuff to help with feel, but the whole palm being rubber I don't think ever really caught on. On page 94 you have a list of some of the great contributors to the magazine. Like I said, Davey Coombs, you have Sheba, Tom Riles, Carl Oakert, Paul Buckley, a lot of iconic names from the early 90s. On the right, you have a cool Renthal ad showing the guys running the Renthal bars at the time. You got Jeff Stanton, Stefan Everts, Greg Albertine, who would win the 250 world title this year and then come to America 2 years later, I guess in '95, and then Mike Kudrowski, all running Renthal. Man, when they came out with these cool colored bar pads and the colored bars, that was a big deal too. I love the looks of these things. At the time, they actually weren't that super strong. I know like a Pro Taper was probably double the strength of one of these things, but there was a certain cachet to the Renthal bar because all the factory guys ran it, and then even to this day, I still run Renthal probably because of that. On page 96 and 97, we have a cool photo of Jeff Stanton, Jeremy McGrath, and Mike Kudrowski celebrating the podium at 93 Anaheim by Sheba. This is a pretty cool photo. It shows Miss Supercross and Miss Coors on there from the days when guys actually used to get a kiss from the trophy girl, and there weren't as many TV cameras up there interviewing right after the race. So it's a pretty cool snapshot of what used to be. All right, we've reached the end. This is the last ad in the second issue of Inside Motocross. It's for Axo Sports' new Aquatour jersey, which was a kind of a jersey designed to be more breathable than the gel prints of the time, which were just terrible at letting air in. These jerseys were cool. I actually had one from the year before, the one like Bradshaw ran. I never actually had the '93, but these were very soft. Like I said, they were not as good for ventilation as like a modern synthetic, but way better than like the cottons and stuff. It did better wicking away sweat and stuff. They're pretty cool. And this is the last ad in the magazine. I certainly hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, let me know, and I will do them for the other 3 issues as I scan them and put them in. I'm also, like I said, planning on posting this on PulpMX so you can actually download it and read it at your leisure. Like I said, again, if you like it, let me know, and I'll put a little effort into doing the others as well. Take care.